Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of the Lost Media Chronicles, a show where we go over various pieces of lost movies, music, books, you name it. I'm Trey, filling in for Randy this time around, and he has pretty much given me free rein to cover any subject my heart desires. Now, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Railway series, which was the series of books that first featured Thomas the Tank Engine and his friends. And seeing as that's been in my mind a lot lately, I wanted to cover two pieces of lost media that had to do with the series.
The story of the Railway series begins in 1911. A boy named Wilbert was born to Vere and Lucy Audrey. Vere, a British reverend, was also a railway enthusiast and used to take Wilbert on walks around his parish, which at one point crossed a railway line. From a young age, Wilbert was fascinated by trains and learned a lot about them from his father. His curiosity was piqued when the family moved to a new home near the main line of the Great Western Railway. There was one particularly steep incline by their house where a tank engine was always ready to help the heavy goods trains up the hill. Wilbert liked to lay awake at night listening to the trains struggling up and imagine the conversation they were having with each other. Years later, Wilbert had a child of his own named Christopher. At the age of 3, Christopher became bedridden with the measles. Using his childhood experiences with trains, Wilbert made up stories to keep Christopher amused. These stories would later become the first 3 stories in the first book of the Railway series.
The interest transferred itself to my son, and when he was ill with measles at the age of 3, it was most natural for me to tell him stories about trains. And he said, "Daddy, what are the engine's names?"
That's the way.
And I invented names on the spur of the moment: Edward, Gordon, Henry, and so on.
Wilbert never got the idea to have the stories published until his wife Margaret saw potential in the stories and urged Wilbert to do something about publishing them. The opportunity came by chance when they found out that a distant cousin of Wilbert's mother had connections in the literary field, and he shopped around Wilbert's stories until interest was shown by a publisher named Edmund Ward. Ward agreed to publish the stories, but only under the condition that Wilbert write a 4th story to resolve a cliffhanger left at the end of the 3rd one. Wilbert happily agreed, and 1945 saw the publication of the first Railway series book, The 3 Railway Engines. The book introduced the characters of Edward, Gordon, and Henry. Thomas wouldn't make his first appearance until his own book the following year.
Now, the Railway series was a huge success from day one, and it wasn't long before people wanted to start seeing it on television.
Obviously, the most successful attempt was a series that came about in 1984. But what many people don't realize is that there was another attempt that happened much earlier in 1953. Now, if you weren't aware of this, that's no surprise, since only one story was known to be televised, and that one episode is now part of that vast graveyard of media that will likely be lost forever.
Despite there being no existing copy of this one-off series, a lot of information has come to light about it.
First off, it was an adaptation of the story, The Sad Story of Henry, and used 00 gauge models made by Hornby to represent the characters. The episode was aired live on the BBC on the afternoon of June 14, 1953, with a, quote, freely adapted narration by Julia Lang, who was cast for the part due to her work on Listen with Mother, a popular British radio show from that time. The broadcast was going well, though, until one of the crew members operating the train set didn't switch one of the points on time, causing the engine to come off the rails. Much to the surprise of the viewers, a big hand suddenly came down and put the engine back on the tracks. That little incident caused a wave of bad publicity for the series, as the story made the front page of newspapers all across Europe, even replacing the hugest story of that time, the 10 Rillington Place murder trial. Both Audrey and his publisher, who had granted rights for the broadcast, were very upset, and the episode that was due to air the following week was first put on hold, and then the series was cancelled entirely. Other attempts were made by the BBC to start another series, but Audrey and his publishers were just not interested, and vowed to continue work on the books instead. In 1972, after having published a total of 26 books and 105 stories, Wilbert retired from the series. The pen would later be picked up again in 1983 by none other than Christopher Audrey himself. The TV series was started by Britt Allcroft the following year, but one of the stipulations of her contract with the Audreys was that she could only adapt stories that appeared in published form first. If Allcroft had an idea for an episode, she would ask the Audreys to write it so that she could then adapt it for television. She even got Wilbert out of retirement for one book so that he could write a Christmas-themed story to wrap up the first season. During the second season, Allcroft wanted to see more stories featuring Thomas, and asked Christopher to write a book with 4 new stories about Thomas's adventures on his branch line. More About Thomas the Tank Engine was what Christopher came up with, and he's claimed it to be his least favorite book. He was unhappy with the title, the stories were rushed to meet the publication deadline, and he'd already written the book that was set to be published that year, but Allcroft's demands put that book on hold. It isn't known for sure which book was replaced, but it's possible that it was a volume the publishers had rejected called Barry the Rescue Engine. That book in question was originally believed to be the planned 50th anniversary volume in 1995, but Christopher has denied that and stated that the book was actually written in the 80s. Since then, it's been a popular theory among fans that More About Thomas the Tank Engine was published in place of the Barry book. That would ordinarily mean that it would have been published the following year, but the publishers just weren't happy with it, so it was excluded from the series altogether. Barry, of course, would have been a new character to the series, but since his book was never published, he was never introduced. However, some little information has been revealed over the years about what type of engine Barry was, and a few fans of the series have made drawings and even simulations of what Barry might have looked like.
Barry's book definitely existed in some shape or form since it was rejected by the publishers. But if it does still exist, it's likely to be in possession of the Audrey family in a draft form, and it will likely never see the light of day. Now, a lot of the more cynical seekers of lost media may wonder what is so important about tracking down these shows from our childhood. And here's the thing about that. Those shows were our childhood. They helped us mold who we were and become who we are today. And here's my personal experience with Thomas the Tank Engine.
My childhood was kind of rough compared to most other ones. The main reason for that was that I was born with dislocated hips, which led to more trouble with my feet that continue to this day. It was definitely worse when I was a kid, though. I was always in and out of the hospital with so many surgeries I can't even count. I don't recall a whole lot about it now, but I have a very vivid memory of Christmas the year I turned 2. My grandma surprised me with a book. It was small enough that my little hands were able to hold it, and on the front cover was a blue train with a big smile on his face. It could have just been my mindset at the time, but I thought there was something very soothing about that smile. The train just seemed to be looking at me and saying, "Everything is going to be all right." My entire family will tell you that was the moment I started getting better. My problems were far from over. In fact, they'd barely begun at that point. But I was smiling a lot more, and just had a better attitude about everything. My family suddenly wanted to know more about that train. They found out his name was Thomas, and that there was also a show called Shining Time Station on PBS that actually had segments featuring Thomas and other trains too. Even after I started school, my mom always made sure she taped that day's episode, so I could come home and watch it after I finished my homework. I was getting Thomas videotapes, more Thomas books, and even toy Thomas trains. My parents always tried to make time to attend to me with all my health issues, but Dad was always at work, and I also had 3 younger siblings that my mom had to worry about. I learned how to operate the VCR fairly quickly, though, and whenever I needed a friend, Thomas would always be there. He helped me become more independent at a very young age, and best of all, he taught me important lessons that I carry with me today, like patience, honesty, and how to be a good friend. And that's why Thomas has remained to be a huge passion of mine to this day.
That about does it for this edition of the Lost Media Chronicles. I want to thank you all for joining us, and Randy will be back next time to talk about some weird, morbid stuff. Thank you. See you later. Now, Barry's book definitely existed in some form since it was rejected by the publishers, but if it does still exist, it's likely to be in possession of the Audreys in a draft form. Okay.
Thanks, asshole! This isn't always about you, shitlord.